We are now entering a new week of Mythic Plus, which also coincides with a new week bringing us some balance tuning. After a month and a half of no changes to specs and classes, we have our weekly recap for today. We have extended our time coming back to this recap by about 10 days this time around, waiting to start the recap right as the balance tuning is applied on this reset. So we might be bringing some more attention to the specs being changed right now, just to see if, a week from now, a couple of weeks from now, the specs being changed, namely Restoration Druid, Preservation Evoker, Marksmanship, Survival, and Elemental, together with Frost Mage when it comes to buffs, and then you have Mistweaver Monk and Subtlety Rogue when it comes to nerfs. Now, in the outlook of Mythic Plus, this is the end of this week, week 17 of Mythic Plus. We have been more or less following what was going on in the previous weeks, which was the continued rise of Retribution Paladin, and at the same time, the continued fall, we can call it like that, of Havoc Demon Hunter. As we kept going, this is about a month difference from when Havoc was very close still to Retribution Paladin, all the way up to now, where Havoc is getting meddled in with the rest of the good but not best other DPS. Outlaw, Demo, Shadow, Fire now are all very, very close to Havoc Demon Hunter. Talking about the specs that are receiving changes in this set of balance tuning, we have, in terms of DPS, we have Survival, we have Marksmanship, we have currently Frost Mage being dead last at the moment, as well as Subtlety, who is the spec being nerfed when it comes to DPS. When it comes to healers, you do have Resto Druid, you do have Preservation Evoker being buffed, as well as Mistweaver Monk being nerfed. What is visible at first glance after a while, this is the score, the average rating being completed by specs at the 26 to 32 level, this reset only. So only this reset, whereas this is the total results on average of the entire season, not just of this last reset. One of the first things that are visible between what's been happening the entire season versus what's been happening recently is not just Red Paladin, but also Havoc Demon Hunter. Because when we go at what's been happening in this last week of Mythic Plus, we can see not just Red. This is something we have at this point mentioned week after week about how stronger they were becoming, perhaps together with Fire Mage after they were being buffed. But, of course, you have to wonder if Fire Mage goes from being present in 6% of the keys and then goes all the way up to 23, and Red Paladin goes from 4 to 24, then who is losing out? Who is getting shrunk when it comes to DPS? We talked about one of the specs getting shrunk already. We talked at length about augmentation and their dominance slowly lowering over time. The other spec at the moment that has been shrinking consistently is Havoc. Havoc is getting actually to even smaller numbers than augmentation. They were at a similar, mid to high 20 level of popularity at the start of the season. In the first couple of months, they were still averaging 22, 23% representation in 26, 27 plus keys level in Mythic Plus. And now they have gotten to basically their lowest ever of the season. That is the main change when it comes to the Mythic Plus popularity. Even if we look at the very high level, so not just 27 to 32 keys, now we're talking about the actually highest keys, we can still see, of course, some Havoc Demon Hunters here and there in this one in the same comp. Then you have a couple more, 3 more different Demon Hunters being present as Havoc in the top keys. But as you can see, they start slowing down in terms of presence, even in the high level. There are fewer and fewer nowadays Havoc Demon Hunters towards the very top. They used to be the dominant force when it comes to melee DPS, and now they have started getting passed by Red Paladin, and then significantly passed by Red Paladin, and at this point they are fighting with Outlaw Rogues for the second spot when it comes to melee DPS. So it's quite visible and confirmed by this current situation when it comes to Havoc. As usual, remember that this popularity doesn't mean this week. This is the whole season. For example, if we are looking at this top result with a Havoc Demon Hunter, this is from 1 month ago. It's not from 2 days ago. So many of these are not even currently still playing and still being popular. They are being overtaken by either Ret or Outlaw, or more importantly by even more ranged DPS. Now we have had this kind of discussion before. What's been going on with Havoc? The spec isn't even being nerfed. It's not that players are jumping ship because they know this patch is hitting and Havoc is being completely destroyed. It's not even that. So what exactly is causing this to happen? This is at this point something we have been playing around with for weeks, trying to figure out what are the causes when one spec suddenly out of nowhere without any particular nerfs starts to become much less played. We talked about Prot Paladin out of nowhere being eaten up by Vengeance, which continues this week. We have talked about the resulting loss of Prot creating a growth of Ret to continue to have the very elusive Combatress available to your group. And then we made the talk about Priest, where Discipline was the popular one without a Shadow Priest, and then Shadow Priest becomes popular when Discipline continuously loses out on the popularity. We had similar talks about the difference between Fire and Augmentation. Augmentation is bringing Bloodlust. We don't really have much of a need for Fire. Fire gets buffed in damage, Augmentation loses out in popularity, and now Fire Mage brings your Bloodlust. Havoc Demon Hunter right now is, as we mentioned before, in the awkward situation where what they bring the most, what they are the strongest in bringing ever since the beginning of the season was damage, right? Havoc was the deliverer of top, in particular, top AoE, especially uncapped or very wide, very large AoE. Havoc was doing quite well, and it was dominating in terms of damage. However, after all, Havoc doesn't really bring much of anything else to your group. Most of the things you can think about a Havoc Demon Hunter bringing, it's gonna be brought by a Vengeance Demon Hunter as well. What is also even more important is that if we were to talk about some very OP things brought by a Demon Hunter, yes, there are some cool things in here like Darkness, even like AoE abilities like Chaos Nova, AoE stuns, etc, but the real powerful one is having 2 charges of Sigils, which includes double charge of Fear, double charge of Chains, double charge of Silences, all things that are available to a Vengeance Demon Hunter and not to a Havoc Demon Hunter. So effectively, the real power of this DPS right here was their damage. So what happens if over time your damage, starts being contested? At first is by Ret, but then over time it's not just Ret, it starts being multiple specs that start getting much closer to your level of power. And on top of that, you're still significantly below, at this point, the Ret Paladin. What happens is that at that point, you don't need Demon Hunters for their utility because it's brought by Vengeance. At this point, their damage is easily beaten by Ret, and they are being matched by Shadow, matched by Outlaw, matched by Fire, so their value just goes further and further down. Why would you rather have a second Demon Hunter when, after losing out Discipline Priest, you can still bring another Priest for example, Power Infusion, maybe for Mass Dispel, maybe for Dominate Mind during Incorporeal, an extra Dispel during Afflicted? What about, of course, bringing Ret Paladin, now that you are losing a Prot Paladin as a tank, the utility, the off-healing, you still have things like Dispels, the crowd controls available still to a Paladin that can be brought by a Ret over a Prot Paladin, and, of course, the number one thing, the Combatress, brought by a Paladin instead. So all these features have contributed to Havoc Demon Hunter losing out significantly in their value over time, down to the point they are in now, which is different than the point they have been all season, which was a stable S-tier spec when it came to Mythic Plus. Nowadays they have been losing out more and more in their value, even though the tuning of this week is not even going to touch Havoc Demon Hunter, is in fact not even going to touch any direct competitor of Havoc, because the only other melee being buffed is just Survival, and Survival is not really at risk of suddenly becoming OP because they are being buffed by 3% in damage. This is not really gonna move the value of Survival very much, even then their value has not dropped significantly and they are losing their stocks. Their rating in Mythic Plus is losing value quickly. So they are now losing out not just to Ret, as we have been mentioning multiple times, their performance continuing to rise, but also to a few of these other high performing specs in Mythic Plus. Not much of any hope, as we mentioned, to the specs being buffed when it comes to the Hunter specs. Nothing really should change. Their damage increase in Mythic Plus. Same goes for Frost Mage, especially given their buff was primarily for single targets, so this is not really going to move much their power in AoE. The other buffs were limited to healers, but both of the buffs, in particular the one to Resto Druid, was for Mythic raid healing, not for Mythic Plus, so this is not really gonna fix much of Resto Druid in Mythic Plus. And then you have the nerf to Mistweaver. But again, it was a nerf to healing, which is mostly gonna be impactful in the raid and not nearly as much in Mythic Plus, where they are continuing to be the popular pick. We have been seeing over time, perhaps worth mentioning slightly, the rise of Resto Shaman. Resto Shaman, even nowadays, has been getting to a reasonable level of popularity in 26 plus keys. Now they are actually above Discipline, which is not something you would have expected even just a month ago, let alone 2 months ago, to have Resto Shaman grow so much in popularity in Mythic Plus. The average score is still significantly lower than a Discipline Priest. It's still, over 140 rating lower, because at the end of the day, if you look at the very high keys, you still see plenty of Discipline Priests at the end of the day. They are still one of the more commonly used top picks when it comes to very high keys. 30 and up, it's still half of them being Discipline. So they are definitely still remaining the number one choice when it comes to the higher level of keys, rather than the more popular bracket of players, where now Resto Shaman is doing better. One possible reason, as it's always worth mentioning, might still be the Bloodlust. As you see here, even Fire has lost quite a bit this week around in terms of popularity. Guess who has the Bloodlust when it comes to healers? Resto Shaman is one of them. So you can now have comps with Resto Shaman, Vengeance, Shadow, Ret, and Outlaw, for example, and be able to bring the healer with the Bloodlust. Perhaps you can use a Fury Warrior, you can still use Havoc, you can still use the Warlocks, even the Druid with the first 3 specs we mentioned, and use your Bloodlust from Resto Shamans. At the end of the day, almost 75% of the DPS in this level of popularity does not have Bloodlust, because the Bloodlust here is brought by 15, 16, 17, 26%, 28% of the DPS, and the remaining ones don't have it. The tanks don't have it, so the only other place you can get your Bloodlust is one of these 2 lines, Preservation or Restoration Shaman. As said, unfortunately, we touched on this before, none of these changes were particularly impactful to begin with. On top of that, most of these changes seem to be more focused around raiding rather than Mythic Plus. This nerf was mostly for single target damage in the raid. This one was mostly to buff the single target damage in the raid. This one was mostly to buff the healing in the raid. So not really expecting any difference in terms of the meta in Mythic Plus, which is slightly unfortunate, right? When you get your first set of tuning in almost 2 months, you were perhaps expecting something a little bit more substantial than what we have gotten in this reset when it comes to tuning. At this point though, after 10.2.6, what's left is going to be the Season 4 and the changes to the tier sets coming in the next season, as well as the balance tuning that will come with the beginning of Season 4. So the question now starts to begin for the players that are still interested in playing Season 4. Of course, the questions around what I will be playing, which specs will be meta, which specs will be improving compared to where they are now, and which specs will continue to be as powerful as they are now. For example, can we expect Vengeance to be at this level of power even in Season 4? Is this level of power of Ret going to continue in the next season, or perhaps even Mistweaver? Will they have the first time ever where they are powerful in 2 seasons in a row? Or is this going to be just a one-hit wonder disappearing in Season 4? That will be the question for next patch at this point, and we will start to be able to see some of the answers as we start getting Season 4 on the PTR. So We will be able to start seeing the dungeon pool in Mythic Plus, the fated effect in Mythic Plus, the possible tuning coming in Season 4, and there is when we can start, theory crafting, tinkering with what is going to happen in terms of meta and in terms of power of the specs in the next season. But for today, this is what we have when it comes to the current situation in Season 3 still, as we are getting the last, I guess, point of balance tuning before the next season, which was, as mentioned already, quite disappointing compared to what we were expecting in terms of the size and the scope of the changes to the specs. So, with this out of the way, I am now going to leave you to your midweek reset day chores type of feeling. Thanks, of course, as usual, to all of the Patreon supporters for the contribution and help to the growth of the channel, which can, as usual, still be given completely for free. You can like and comment down below, as well as subscribe to the channel itself. Now, with these pointless things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, first time in a while, we are doing a video at night. Usually we get them done in the afternoon, mid to late afternoon. Now though, we are pretty deep in the evening.